Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kathleen McLean, a programmer here at the Art Gallery of Ontario in the Department of Public Programming and Learning, where we foster creativity, learning, and dialogue through experiences with art and ideas. We present talks, special events, performances, and studio art programs for over 250,000 people each year. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight and acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Ontario is on Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee territory. I'm really pleased to introduce Kenneth Brummel, who joined the AGO as the Assistant Curator of Modern Art on August 11th, 2014 at 8:30 in the morning because he's really prompt. Kenneth is a specialist in late 19th and 20th century American and European art, and he's worked in curatorial positions at the Cincinnati Art Museum, the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He completed his graduate work at Harvard University and the University of Chicago, where he was a PhD student in art history. Following Kenneth's talk, after abstract expressionism, making sense of painting in the 1960s, there will be questions. He has agreed to answer them. Questions from both you, the audience here, and also anyone who might be watching this online. So please join me in welcoming Kenneth Brummel.
Thank you. I'm very happy to see that so many people seem to be so excited about abstraction. This lecture is one just to help everyone understand the logic behind the two installations on the first floor, the two installations one encounters after one turns left after passing through the ticket booth. And what I wanted to do with this lecture is describe how the problem of sense, meaning we make sense of things by putting them in order, but for the critics who were analyzing painting in the 50s and the 60s, what was at stake for them was sense in terms of what were valid sensations in front of paintings and what were the valid stimuli for paintings. And also, what is a legitimate reaction to Jackson Pollock, meaning there were many different reactions in Jackson Pollock. There's not just one Jackson Pollock. Everyone has their own personal Jackson Pollock. And it seems that depending on how one interpreted him, different styles developed. So I just wanted to maybe outline, adumbrate a trajectory for you in terms of where painting was. So around 1940, Clement Greenberg, when he Clement Greenberg writes in 1960 and 1940 that painting, as you can see in this example by Gorky, Entitled Organization, was stuck in a closed cubism. And what he meant by that, you'll notice that we have this tight articulation of geometrically configured planes. And you'll notice that each plane seems to have a thick outline, and it seems that each plane is graded to a specific size, and also the colors distributed in order to create almost a perfect balance across the canvas. And the result is almost as if state has been eliminated. So when I say perfect balance, you see the yellow, the orange balanced here. Turquoise, turquoise. And it seems as if the size of each plane and the distribution of color creates a perfect flatness that is almost parallel to the imaginary picture plane. And one example of exception, of course, being this yellow circle. And it seemed that artists around the 30s and the 40s were stuck in the Cubist grid, and it really wasn't until the introduction of surrealism during the emigration, the mass emigration results of Nazism in Europe to New York of surrealist artists that painters were able to thin their paint with turpentine. They were able to apply a more sinuous application of line to the canvas as they were experimenting with different types of paint strokes. In the case of Gorky, what you see here is his use of the automobile liner's brush. This is what automobile detailers use when they're applying paint to an automobile surface, and when you load the brush with paint, you can see the calligraphic mileage one can obtain in terms of allowing line just to undulate across an entire surface. But more importantly, the paint becomes thinned. It's not thick and densely applied as it is in the Gorky. This Gorky, by the way, is a few inches thick, and you can see he was just so deliberate in terms of the distribution of paint, the clear balancing of each plane so that nothing would actually assert itself spatially. But you see here also that we have the emergence of the artist's hand in terms of leaving traces of the brush in not just this these ribbons of red paint, but also, in what I would call the squiggle of mustard. But importantly, what we have here is the opening of painting. Painting is becoming fluid, it's becoming open, it has a buoyancy, and color and line are becoming increasingly disaggregated, color almost asserting its own autonomy. But what happens is that this also becomes mannered, and around the mid-50s, de Kooning, when he paints his women's series, you'll notice that we do have the free brushwork, but this brushwork becomes graded into one another where it begins almost to model the form, introducing a representational schema that's long been abandoned in painting. But it's also made a very tight canvas. You'll notice that the canvas is very tight, it's very agitated. It lacks the kind of buoyancy. There's no room really to breathe in de Kooning. You have this frontally positioned figure that seems to be ambiguously silhouetted against a modeled background. But the expressive brushwork, the endless scumbling, the endless scraping, the endless overlaying, it just seems to create a very compact, tight picture. And this tightness that was becoming a result of this gesturality really seemed to become exacerbated by the time we get to Klein. And so what we see with Klein is a dense configuration of brushstrokes, but this dense configuration of brushstrokes don't seem to open the picture plane. They don't seem to create a certain dynamism. Instead, they seem to depict agitation. And when I say depict agitation, you'll notice that these edges of these different fields are heavily worked, reworked, revised, so as to create, as you can see here, a serrated edge, almost as if he's trying to depict the expressivity of a loaded brushstroke, leaving its various streaks and frayed edges as it leaves the canvas. Now, when Greenberg was looking at painting in the 60s and he was seeing what was happening to abstract expressionism, he created a pithy and, biting phrase to describe this mannerism that I'm describing. He called it the 10th Street touch. And the 10th Street touch for him was these streaks, the spatters, the ripples, the specks that are left by a loaded brush when applied to the surface of the canvas. So he's referring to, again, these streaks. He's also referring to how the density of these streaks creates this dense, highly agitated surface, but it's so closed, it's so tight, it doesn't really seem to expand outward. And it's almost as if this demonstration of gestural virtuosity has become mannered, almost as if it's become a regimented performance. And it seems to be something that everyone's repeating again and again. He sees this also in Motherwell. So you can see here the loaded brush that streaks and frays out at its edges. You see the spatters. And you also see that these painters have completely abandoned color. We're almost in a completely tonal system. And so these paintings are not just becoming more and more densely agitated with these hyperbolically performed brushstrokes, but color's been completely abandoned. And even someone such as Gottlieb, who he felt was at least trying to work out of that dense, compact system that was developing with abstract expressionism by using circles as a geometric configuration and maybe create some clarity and linearity within the space of the canvas, you still see the retention of this 10th Street touch, these spatters, these specks, the fraying out of the loaded stroke. And for him, this mannerism and the fact that it was proliferating, he called it a blight, was the justification for his 1964 exhibition, Post-Painterly Abstraction, which we are not so much replicating, but which is the pretext for the exhibition to Einstall and the Lynn Galleries, which I hope you'll enjoy. Rothko, however, was an artist for Greenberg who was an abstract expressionist who didn't waver. And what did he mean by that? What he meant by this is, you see, we begin to have color separated into distinct rectangular fields, but look at the brushwork along the edges. It's still very fuzzy. It seems to acknowledge the need for an expressive touch and the need for a trace of the artist's hand in abstract expressionism, but it's organized. And because it's organized and because color is becoming disaggregated and separated into planes, the red can expand outward, the brown will recede into the black field, and what you have is an active picture that begins to breathe, where color begins to create its own space. And this was the type of art that he felt, would rescue painting from its increasing mannerisms. And he also took objection to what he was calling furtive bas-relief. And what he meant by this is a detail of Gotham News from the Albright Knox. You see here with de Kooning constantly revising, reapplying, scraping away, and then applying again his paint, and then also even using newspaper to control its drying. paint is no longer flat on a two-dimensional surface. A canvas is, a flat two-dimensional surface, but it's almost creating a relief. Almost, it's becoming its own sculpture. And so what Greenberg saw with these increasing coagulations of paint was that paintings were actually becoming bas-relief sculptures, which to him was just a violation of the medium, and that painting for him should entrench itself within its own medium and logic. So in the New Look exhibition, I open with this Jack Bush. And I open with it for a reason, because I wanted to show how an artist in 1960 would be struggling to liberate himself from abstract expressionism. So what does he do here? You see that the green paint, the evergreen green paint, is thinned with turpentine, and it's applied very thinly to the rabbit glue sizing that is on the canvas. He then separates the red and blue bands so that they seem to frame this white circle that seems to expand outward. But you'll notice that we don't have the virtuosity of gesture of de Kooning. We have a disaggregation of color into distinct areas, not so much patches, but areas that assert themselves autonomously, but that the painting almost seems to breathe. But you see that he's trying to find a way to liberate color from touch. In the 1959 example, you see this, it's more, let's just say, explicit. So you see that we have this, giant outsized, phallic shape that's framed by this mustard field, but then emanating from it, almost extending out of it, breathing out of it, we have these turquoise and vermilion areas. But he's not. But he's still kind of caught in the logic of the easel. And what I mean by that is he's painting upright, he stretches the canvas, he hangs it, he places it against the wall, but he's using a sizing on the canvas that enables him, to, control somewhat the application of the paint. But if you notice here, do you see this vestige of yellow? He's still revising. And you notice again, some would look at this and say, oh, do you see the fraying edges here? Here's the 10th Street touch. Why isn't he getting rid of the 10th Street touch? Why is he still locked into de Kooning and Klein? But you see that he's trying to find a way to work out of that system, and it's really through thinning paint and trying to have the paint absorb into the canvas. When he's working in 1960, he hadn't yet quite learned the lessons of Helen Frankenthaler. And Frankenthaler was really known for her horizontal practice, and she almost became a lodestone for artists who were really struggling with abstract expressionism in the 50s. And as you can see in her studio, Helen Frankenthaler, she paints on the floor, and she uses unsized, unprimed cotton duck canvas, meaning there's no sizing, no priming applied to the canvas. It's a raw canvas that will absorb the pigment that is applied. It's a very spatial, physical manner of painting, meaning she's literally on the canvas that is horizontally prone, distributing color. The result of pouring and soaking pigment and blotting it into the actual weave of the canvas for Clement Greenberg created a certain kind of openness. And you'll notice with this painting here, from the center you have this centrifugal expansion of grays that seem almost to lap outward from the canvas, and then you have this extension of a green band from this node, this mustard node that seems to be embedded right in the center of the picture. And it's this buoyancy that's created through the elimination of touch that Greenberg really started to champion. And for a younger, but also importantly, when we were discussing, the heavily worked surfaces of Gorky, of Klein, of de Kooning, we were discussing, in the case of Bush, the revision, the elimination and the attempt to somehow modify the edges so as, to balance your composition. But when you're staining, when you're working as Helen Frankenthaler is, you can't revise. When you pour pigment into unsized, unprimed cotton duck canvas, you get one chance. And, and this is why she would say you have, a good image is one that you made once. There was no going back, there were no corrections, there are no mulligans. And so what you see here is that painting for Greenberg then, it's not just the elimination of gesturality, but it's almost as if you have to have just a pure blind intention in terms of creating a picture. So the picture area becomes an environment, and I choose this slide just so you can see that when Helen Frankenthaler's painting, she's embedded in an environment. You're no longer in front of an upright, flat surface of an easel picture that you visually control, where you can visually organize where your colors are going to be placed, so you can relate them to one another, part to part. You're physically embedded. You can't quite see what you're doing. You might put color here, you might put color here, but physically, You know where it's in relation to your body, but you can't quite pinpoint it with your eyes. Here is a photograph of her staining. You know, see, she's occupying the center of her canvas. She takes the bucket of thin paint and pours. So you can begin to see that, no, the hand is not actually involved. It is a very gestural, expressive maneuver, but again, how does one revise this? How does one control this? So you can begin to see that the whole logic of painting is completely changing under her hands. So I choose Mountains and Sea, which is a fantastic picture on extended loan at the National Gallery, just because when you look closely, do you see this arc here? This is the edge of her paint can. You know, so you can see the physical, messy nature, the bodily manner in which she's painting, where she's on a canvas. The canvas is prone horizontally to the ground. She has her paint canvas. Here you can see the traces of her posterior, and then, you know, she's pushing color across the surface, but it's not as if she's controlling the placement of color as if she's in front of an easel. She's physically embedded, placing color, feeling it, and using really just the feeling of color to organize the canvas. It's a very different mode of composition. It's not the kind of composition that one finds in the easel. This lovely picture from Cincinnati, I don't know if you can see in the reproduction, but you can see these vertical lines. Those vertical lines that you see in the canvas are a result of the fact that she's staining pigment into unsized, unprimed canvas that is on the floor of her studio, and the traces of the floorboards are embedding themselves, imprinting themselves into the canvas. But again, what you see here is she's pouring, but she's taking so much care, even though how do you control this when you're pouring, to not let these areas of lambent, bright color overlap, lest they become blended, or lest they blend and become muted. But instead, by having these areas remain autonomous, they're able to breathe and expand outward, and this entire area here of unsized, unprimed cotton duck almost becomes its own color that's activated in the canvas. You can almost think of her mode of painting as if she were just creating giant watercolors on the floor, which would make sense because when you paint with watercolor, you're generally painting horizontally, and the watercolor surface generally absorbs. But to give you a sense of how she escapes the mannered, congealed, ossified regime of hyperbolically performed expressive touch in abstract expressionism, look at the surface. I mean, you see that the fuchsia and the gray, they're stained into the weave. And when she describes her canvas and what a good painting looks like, she will say that the painting is so completely, utterly flat. There's no surface incident. You can almost skate across it. And so, you know, you can see that for her, liberating color from abstract expressionism, you know, entailed eliminating her hand, eliminating any surface effect, and allowing color just to exist within the weave itself. Now, Morris Louis, he's in Baltimore, Helen Frankenthaler is in New York, and he and Kenneth Noland, who lived in Washington, D.C., Clement Greenberg would always make the argument they enjoyed the luxury of distance, meaning they weren't in New York, they didn't have to go to 10th Street and drink with the guys and then, you know, get caught up in the 10th Street touch. But instead, they were distant. They can see what was going on in New York, and they can see that what was wrong with New York and how painting was becoming repetitive in New York. In 53, I think it's February 5th, 1953, Lewis and Noland make their pilgrimage to Helen Frankenthaler, and they see this woman staining on unsized, unprimed canvas in their studio, and then they return to Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and Morris Louis, in his home in Baltimore, he was generally working either in his dining room or as an attic, very close quarters, would take his Magna paint, it's a plastic-based acrylic paint with pigments made by Louis Bocours in upstate New York, and he would raise the canvas from the ground and create folds and pour pigment. And this is what you see. You see the pores from the stretcher bar that he would use to raise the fabric from the ground, and then it would puddle as it hit the ground, and he would just let it dry. And you can see how he's using this pouring technique of Helen Frankenthaler, but he is lifting the canvas off the ground. But observe in the center this massive area of unsized, unprimed cotton duck canvas. But even though unpainted, it becomes a highly active part of this picture. You stand in front of this picture, it's almost as if it envelops you, meaning it wraps its body around you, and you're in this central area that seems to pulsate and expand and contract, and then these areas of color seem to meld together and they become this dark green line in your peripheral vision. But you see that by allowing the color just to exist autonomously on this empty field, he allows it to breathe and pulsate and expand, and color tends to become clear and open. And this was the counterpoint to abstract expressionist formula that Greenberg was really seeking, which is why he would include Morris Louis in his 1964 exhibition. And this is also why I allow this to be the painting that greets you when you enter the first room. So with work, so we think of Morris Louis and we think of the repetitive iterative act of pouring, and you can see it's almost a repetition of the same logic of Jackson Pollock. Morris Louis famously said that Frankenthaler was what enabled painting to move from Pollock to what was possible. And clearly what was possible for him was pouring and using the logic of gravity and to control his pores, but to also create highly dynamic surfaces that are largely predicated on the autonomous fields of color. Jackson Pollock and the iterative practice of flinging paint on the horizontally prone canvas, this certainly did inflect Lewis's practice. It certainly inflected Helen Frankenthaler's practice. This is how she learned to paint horizontally. But we come to the question of what did Pollock achieve for Greenberg? And for Greenberg, it was this repetition of flinging paint that created this overall texture, what he called the all-over, and these are called the all-over paintings in 1948, that for him, Greenberg really enabled Jackson Pollock to create a type of painting that, for him, precipitated the crisis of the easel. And what he meant by this is, usually easel pictures are hierarchical. You have a section where you enter, a section where, when you look at a landscape, there's a foreground, middle ground, background. When you look at a Matisse, there are balanced areas and there's a center, so you know where to enter the picture and then you know where to let your eye drift. Where do you begin and end with this? Where does one enter a Pollock? There is no entry point. There is no point at which you can penetrate the picture, and there's certainly no point at which you're asked to pull out. You're just asked to linger. And so it's this non-hierarchical, polyphonic a mode of composing that for Greenberg was a complete dismantlement of everything that preceded it in terms of painting. But Greenberg also commented on the size. This is a massive picture. It floods your retina. It's maybe 12 feet wide, and if you think of the span of a typical human body, 6 feet. And for Greenberg, it was this massive scale that seemed to envelop you, that liberated itself from all materiality and seemed to hover before your eyes, as if it were just a complete optical mirage. And so when one looks at a Pollock, one sees the skein of paint undulate back and forth, but the entire composition, including the unpainted areas between the flung paint or between the coagulated puddles, all participate in this hallucinated illusion. And here, when you look at the close-up, what Greenberg describes in terms of this being a decorative mode of painting, meaning decorative insofar as you have a generalization of the same element across the entire canvas, you look closely and you see how you see the repetition of the flung paints, you see the coagulation of the puddles, you see the rippling in the thick paint that is collected on the surface, but it all seems to articulate through one another to create a uniformed vision. This, he claims, is a legacy of Impressionism, and I show you Monet's water lilies from the Orangerie, and you can see that the decorative, in terms of Monet's repetition of the long brushstroke across the entire canvas, a non-hierarchical presentation of fields of color. And you look closely at Monet and you see it's almost very similar to what Greenberg's describing with the iterative, repetitive structure of Pollock flinging paint, where you have the long ribbons of undulating strokes that are then layered with different scumbles, but it is through that repetition that you get this generalized surface that lends itself just to vision alone. If you sit in the Orangerie, you sit in front of these long canvases, which are installed so that they are convex, but you just seem almost to imagine your body disincarnated, hovering as a pure optical ray in front of this splendid display of reflections and of water lilies and of nature. And you get lost to the point at which you forget that this is indeed, a depiction of something that might exist. It just becomes a tapestry of pulsating color. And this is what Greenberg wanted to achieve. He wanted painting that would be visual, that would be decorative, that would lend itself to the eye. So when he was confronted with someone such as Frank Stella, fine. It is, a unified black field. It is highly structured. It's not coagulated and expressive with all of this unnecessary agitation that one finds in an abstract expressionist picture. But for him, it was slick, it was hard, it was an object. And if you notice the deductive structure, and what we mean by this when we say deductive structure is you deduce the shape of the lines, you see his painted lines, from the shape of the canvas. So you have a rectangular canvas, you have these rectangular lines. It all seems to bring the gaze in from the edge to the center. It's the complete opposite of what Greenberg's arguing in terms of the centrifugal expansion. It's centripetal. So when you have an artist such as Noland who's trying to deal with his contemporaries, but at the same time who wants to liberate color from the warped logics of abstract expressionism, yes, he starts in the center. He plants his circle dead center in the canvas, and he's painting horizontally just as Helen Frankenthaler. He's staining the pigment into the canvas. It's interesting when you think of him planting his circle in the center in the title Harvest. And then from this planted, perfectly limbed red circle emanate these bands. What's lovely about these bands, however, you notice his reference to the 10th Street touch, the fraying and the streaks that are created by the loaded brush as it, loses its pigment at the end. So, while he's allowing color to become liberated from touch and from these, tightly coagulated, heavily tactile planes of abstract expressionism, he still, acknowledges his forebears. But then you have this broad area of unsized, unprimed cotton duck canvas, and when one looks at this, one has the illusion almost of a pinwheel, meaning these two bands spinning out of control on this buoyant floating field that hovers before your eyes, and it's quite magnificent. And this issue of trying to create forms that pulsate and emanate outward from a center is certainly explored also by Kenneth Lockheed. You see here that dark green center, it's quite literal, the title, invites one to look at this dark green center, but then when one engages with this painting physically or optically over time, this dark green center melds with this green center, this tangerine with this red, and this yellow with the unsized area. And what you have are these complicated color dynamics that begin to merge, emerge, and drift, and you have a highly dynamic painting. And what's also interesting about Lockheed, when you think of painting in the wake of Frank Stella, these rectangles, one can make the argument that these are deductive structures, but you notice his edges are softer. They're almost semi-autonomous from the edge. They acknowledge the edge, but they're still their own distinct pictorial units. And it seems, he and Noland, they're trying to acknowledge the geometric impulse of Stella, but they're trying to resist it and still concentrate on the liberation of color, the concentration of feeling and sense in color. For them, that is the legitimate sensation of painting in 1962. So 1962, when Frank Stella shocks the world at Leo Castelli with his shaped canvases, and here we have a U and a S and a T. You see the deductive bands. These are copper paintings, meaning they're still within the tonal system that was being criticized by Clement Greenberg and his adherents. But it's interesting when you think of what Frank Stella does with the easel. So Clement Greenberg makes the argument with the easel that it's becoming decorative, and the whole organizational, compositional structure of easel painting in the early 20th century was dismantled by Pollock. Frank Stella decides, well, I'll criticize the easel, but I'll shape the canvas. Canvases are usually rectangular, they're usually square. In the Rococo, you might have had undulating contours, but in general, in the West, the easel picture is square or rectangular. He challenges that convention. But Greenberg's artists noticed this development, and I think they did react to it. So in the same year, here's Morris Louis, and this hangs in a new look. We have this columnar painting. It's a rectangle, but it's distinctly shaped, if you notice. And if you look at how he poured his pigment, it's similar. He pours, and then you see it dripped, and then they seem to acknowledge the edge of the canvas. One could make the argument that they're deductive, but there's a soft human edge to them. They're not the mechanical kind of deductive structure that one finds in Frank Stella. And then also, because they are distinct color units, they do vibrate, some protrude, some recede. So you still have the kind of illusion and freedom and pulsation of color that Greenberg certainly wanted, but there is this recognition of Stella's gesture in 1962 at Leo Castelli. Kenneth Noland is a bit, let's just say, he's a bit more humorous in his response. So this is C in 1964. The C you see comes from the right angle. But so we have Frank Stella's deductive structures, but we have distinct fields of unmodulated high-keyed color that do create optical illusions. But what does he do? This is a square. He just merely rotates the square 45 degrees. Here, Frank, you want a shaped canvas? Well, a square is a shape, in case you didn't notice. I'll just rotate this 45 degrees. I'll follow your deductive structure, but I'll add some color, and I'll produce something that's a little bit more interesting to look at, or at least this is what he was thinking. So you can see, how, even in 1964, as post-painterly abstraction is being codified, these artists are trying to deal with developments around them. So again, here you have Kenneth Nolan's C, and you think of just the kind of rivalry that develops between these artists. So here's his C, but his C is fully contained within a square, albeit one rotated 45 degrees. And the C references, well, the U, the T, the S. It's almost okay if we want to play alphabet, then here's the C. But Frank Stella in 1964, he begins to incorporate color into his practice, and he also begins to have his irregular polygonal shaped canvases. This is Ossipee 2. Ossipee 2 refers to a town in New Hampshire, and this is where he would fish. And I guess in Ossipee, New Hampshire, there's a mountain with a cabin on the side. So many liken this pentagon to a cabin on the slope of a mountain. But what I want to direct your attention to is not just the use of high-key colored and how that does produce some spatial illusions and spatial dynamics within the picture, but notice how his edges are metered. So the deductive bands are becoming incompletely deductive, and notice how this pentagon doesn't repeat the actual shape of the canvas, nor does this declared parallelogram. So what Stella is doing is he's almost allowing illusion and color to enter into his geometric system, but he's allowing the shapes that he depicts to have a partial reference to the edge, but then they articulate themselves as their own shapes within the canvas. It's a difference between what the critic Michael Fried called literal shape, which would be the literal shape of the painting, and then depicted shape, the shape depicted in the canvas. And so you have this dialectical struggle between literal and depicted shape, and it's really dramatized, this struggle between shape and color in this lovely picture that is a promise gift that hangs in the Fudger Rotunda. And what you see here is, Stella, being the one to work with the system, uses the a priori protractor system, that interlock, that he draws onto the canvas, and then he will paint within the lines these high-keyed colors that do create their own spatial illusionism, but they're locked within the a priori protractor system that he had established. Now, in that gallery, you'll notice I juxtapose that picture with this painting by Robert Motherwell, painted at approximately the same time. And the reason I chose this juxtaposition, so in 1966, there is an interview with Donald Judd and Frank Stella, Questions to Stella and Judd. And Robert Motherwell has a copy of this in the archives of the Daedalus Foundation. And Stella describes the painting as an object. What you see is what you see. There's no illusion. There's no trace of the artist's hand. There's no subjectivity. And then, in the margins of his copy of this interview, Motherwell's like, absolutely not. He's just appalled. And so, what's his response to this notion that a system should govern the organization of a painting? Well, notice that where color is subordinated completely to line and completely to an a priori geometric system in Stella, Motherwell begins with a heavily, lightly brushed surface of, a wash of orange that's over a cadmium yellow field. So he begins with the premise that color is the foundation of painting, not inscribed lines. Over this atmospheric wash, and it does seem to pulsate and expand, this lovely orange wash that's almost buttressed and buffeted by this cadmium yellow field that undergirds it, we have the incomplete deductive structure of 3 charcoal lines, mimicking the rectangular shape of the canvas. But of course it's incomplete because he would never, want to repeat a structure, Motherwell, in his work. And then what happens optically when one's in front of this painting is that these 3 charcoal lines are completely overwhelmed by the atmospheric wash of orange that surrounds it. And so you can see Motherwell, in response to Stella, saying, no, it's not what you see, and structure doesn't govern the logic of painting. Color and the feeling of color, the experience of color, the life of color is what defines painting, and it shall forever. And so I pose this because these rivalries are real. These are real debates, and the sensation of structure might have been the logic motivating Stella, but it's really the sensation of color that's motivating Motherwell. So now Jack Bush. This picture from 1970, you see these metered edges. It's very clear to me that Jack Bush, was looking at Frank Stella, saw that Frank Stella's bands were becoming semi-autonomous from the rectangular shape of the canvas, and he certainly adapts this. But notice here these lovely, brushed strokes, the 10th Street touch, resurfacing in a canvas where we have distinct areas of color that create these optically illusioned planes. You see one plane here that seems to recede, this seems to recede. You have this push-pull between two planes. But Jack Bush, seems to be adopting the geometry of Stella, the 10th Street touch of abstract expressionism, but allowing color to live and create its own distinct space within a painting. But I also, and this will become important soon, I want to direct your attention to the fact that, look at Bush, he's framed. If you look at the Stella, do you see how this system, this a priori system of protractors seems to expand indefinitely beyond the confines of the canvas, almost as if the canvas is just a mere fragment? For Greenberg, this was an issue, meaning for Greenberg, paintings had edges, they ended. They were distinct things that hung on walls, they didn't extend into the world surrounding them. So you can see that while Bush is certainly referencing the metered edges of a Frank Stella, the geometry of a Frank Stella, the incomplete containment of shapes and color within a Frank Stella, he's still nonetheless framing his pictures, asserting their autonomy. But it wasn't just, but there were other reactions to the 10th Street touch. I show this example from the Art Institute of Chicago just to remind you of this 10th Street touch, the spatters, the fraying of the edges of the loaded brushstroke, the heavily worked edges, the tonal system. Gene Davis, this lovely picture in our collection that hangs in a new look, almost seems to be, let's just say, a reorganization of the 10th Street touch in the abstract expressionist system. What you see here is our trued and faired areas of white and black, taking the tonal system, organizing them into a geometric configuration, but varying the sizes so that black and white can become color and almost treated as colors. And when you stand in front of this picture, it vibrates, this large area of white in the center, it just seems to breathe. And it's almost, it's lovely to see someone such as Gene Davis take the system of abstract expressionism, refract it through Greenberg's logic, and then create a painting where black and white are no longer tonal, but they become colors. And it makes me think of Matisse in 1946 in an interview famously said that black is a color, and it certainly is in that painting. But there were other reactions to the 10th Street touch. Now, again, just to refresh your memory with the 10th Street touch, here we see our copula, the heavily reworked edges, the tonal system, the frayed edges, the spatters, the collecting of paint, and we see that it's used in Jim Dine. What is this? Well, this seems to be a plane with the frayed edges of the 10th Street touch, but what does he do? Well, he almost seems to insert ready-made white paint, almost to imply, almost to satirize the 10th Street touch, meaning these mannered, repetitive gestures of these frayed, agitated edges you artists, seem to create as if you're on an assembly line system. Well, I'll just take white paint, literally from the assembly line, and embed it in the black plane, just to show all of you that, indeed, all of you are making just mass-produced paintings, just as this is a mass-produced sink. But he's still within the same tonal system of abstract expressionism, and it's quite lovely. But for someone like Greenberg, this wouldn't be a legitimate response to abstract expressionism because the world of the quotidian thing, the everyday object, is invading the matrix of the painting. But for Dine, it seemed as if, the 10th Street touch was becoming a mass-produced object. It was something that people were just repeating again and again. And certainly, if I wanted to create a complicated optical relationship between black and white, I'll use black paint, but I'll just embed some used white paint in the form of a white china basin, and I'll create the color dynamics there. And then, I guess, in a more literary manner, allow the white to literally spring, from the picture as if water was coming out of the faucet. Obviously, Dine is also referencing Duchamp in the urinal in the ready-made, but he's also referencing, in my opinion, Magritte, which is what makes this picture quite complicated. And I think a lot of people want to approach Dine as some type of facile combination of art and life, but for me, I think it's it's a lot more rigorous. You notice the pipe, and you notice this painted shadow. So it's interesting because a real pipe wouldn't cast a painted shadow. And you think of Magritte, and you think of his Cécile Nepin pipe paintings, right? Meaning there's a pipe there, but the text tells you it's not a pipe, right? So what is it? And here, I think this relation between reality and illusion becomes confounded to the point at which while everyday objects had invaded the space of painting, they're becoming embedded within its logic. And it's an interesting maneuver on his part, which I think really does complicate him as an artist. So pop art, emerging about the same time as post-painterly abstraction for Greenberg, was also reacting to Pollock. And their main critic was a man named Alan Caprow, who wrote a fantastic essay in 1958 entitled The Legacy of Jackson Pollock. And he begins really, along the same terms as Greenberg. He describes the non-hierarchical system one finds in a Pollock, meaning you have this iterative distribution or the iterative gesture that's repeated again and again across the entire surface of the canvas just to create a generalized field that has no hierarchy. There's no beginning, middle, or end. For him, this was how Jackson Pollock destroyed painting. Jackson Pollock, for him, also destroyed painting because of the sheer size. The size created an environment for Alan Caprow that included the artist, that included the spectator, and what he meant by this was when you're in front of a Pollock, it wraps itself around you. So art is no longer a distinct object on the wall that exists at an arm's length from your body, but instead it wraps itself around you. It creates an environment. So it almost begins to occupy your physical space. This expansion of painting into the space around it was one he allegorizes through the surface of Pollock. So Full Fathom 5, this picture, just so maybe I can unpack what I mean with some of these terms. First, this was an easel picture. You notice how there's this pink area here, and it was set off here, orange, orange. But then, as he was painting this easel picture, he decided, forget it. I'm putting it on the ground, and I'm going to start pouring paint. So this is what he does. And here you see all this detritus and trash. You have a button, you have nails, you have a cigarette. And, Caprow's looking at Pollock, and he's thinking, so this guy, he disrupts any sense of hierarchy. He creates this giant scale, but then literal things are embedded in the matrix of his picture on this horizontal plane. So, for Caprow, he's seeing the horizontal picture where the everyday seems to spill into it. And for him, painting is no longer a distinct object with edges, but it's almost a continuation of daily life. And it's almost as if, and so you can see how he becomes, a critical champion of someone such as Rauschenberg. And Rauschenberg, here you have these two wooden panels that are joined, horizontally predicated, parallel to the floor. But what's attached to it? We have a taxidermy goat that he bought from a store on 7th Avenue. We have text, we have wood, we have a tire. I mean, you see the daily life randomly embedding itself within the matrix of the picture, but then the picture being horizontally oriented, it doesn't relate to you visually. When you, as a visitor, enter this gallery, this has a physical relationship with you. You have to circumambulate it. You're no longer looking at something that's hovering before your eyes, but you're dealing with an object that's sharing physical space with you. The Combine is an interesting object. And we are lucky enough at the AGO to own Story, which I think is interestingly titled because you think of Story and you think of Greenberg, and he discusses, or Caprow, and they discuss the non-hierarchical polyphonic system of Jackson Pollock, meaning not having a beginning, middle, or end. As a story, when you think of classical narrative structure, you have a beginning, middle, and end. And so Story, here you have Robert Rauschenberg creating this object on stage during 4 performances of Merce Cunningham's Story, a 1963 ballet that he composed. Now, this is occurring at the Phoenix Theatre in London, and so over the 4 nights of the performance, here you have Rauschenberg making this object. Now, the source of the materials, and you see that we have disparate objects here. We have plywood, we have wood, we have paint, metal, rubber, fabric. We have just all this assorted junk that the man found in the backstage of the theater. So it was randomly collected backstage, and he has then assembled this on stage. But Rauschenberg, he was in many ways Caprow's ideal artist. So when Caprow was discussing Pollock destroying painting and painting disintegrating into the social field around it, he also said that artists were no longer painters or sculptors or poets. You were just an artist. You worked with everything. You worked with sight. You worked with sound. You worked with smell, because an artist wasn't really limited to a medium, but you were working with the entire cityscape that surrounded you. Meaning after Pollock destroyed painting, all one could do is literally work with everyday things. So here's Rauschenberg making his combine on stage as if he's a performer, but he was also the set designer for Merce Cunningham during the company's or the troops' travel in Europe, and he created the set with items he found backstage. He was also the costume designer, so Rauschenberg would arrive with 2 duffel bags with garments that he had found, in various locations, thrift stores or wherever. He would just dump them in the wings of the stage, and, well, you chose your costume, and that was your costume for the evening. And so, Rauschenberg, becomes a collaborator. He's your post-disciplinary collaborative artist who is creating sets. He's a costume designer. He's working with Merce Cunningham. There he is with John Cage in 1964 in London, probably during the Phoenix Theater performance. John Cage, the famous composer who really allowed chance to inflect the logic of music. And when you think of story and you think of this random organization of found materials, this, I guess, organization of just chance, it's very similar to the syntax and logic of Merce Cunningham's ballet. Merce Cunningham's ballet story had 18 sections, but each performance, the 18 sections were randomly organized, meaning meaning there would be a different order, and depending on that random organization, the composition can last between 15 to 40 minutes. And so here you have a heavily structured system but that can be pieced together to create something very random. Just as you have the heavily structured system of finding objects backstage that then you randomly organize on the surface of the combine. So you see how the syntax of Cunningham's ballet begins to inflect the syntax of the combine. So we have the artist who is now the theatrical performer, working with sound, working with costumes, who's working in a generalized space, performing in a space that includes a theater audience and performers, and now we have Claes Oldenburg. Here he is in the first iteration of the store on 2nd Street, and you can see that we have these sculptures that he makes from plaster on canvas with chicken wire. He paints, he replicates quotidian things, but the store is an experience. It's an environment. It includes him. There he is sitting, selling his wares. It includes you. You enter this space, but it's also a storefront that's continuous with the storefronts that one would find, on East 2nd Street or anywhere else in Manhattan. So the gallery and the work of art becomes continuous with the daily experience of commerce and of late capitalist life. He closes the store, and what begins to happen? Well, he opens the Ray Gun Theater in the same space. These are happenings. What is a happening? Well, we see it's almost as if what Capra was describing with Jackson Pollock's painting literally wrapping itself around the artist and the viewer and creating this non-hierarchical space of action. Now painting literally unfolds itself into a field in which the spectator, there you have Andy Warhol in a gray suit, you have John Chamberlain leaning against a pillar, and I'm convinced the second pillar from the back, that's Frank Stella, that's a young Frank Stella. So you have these messy situations that become these performances, but in many ways, if we're to take Caprow seriously, it almost becomes a spatialized painting, a painting that does seem to really operate by chance and can seem to really include and encompass and consume anything around it. The second store follows in September of 1962, and I show this because I do, and I'm convinced that although it's a floor burger that we own, the floor burger, I guess this is where I'm moving, the floor burger. The floor burger, I think, can only really be understood when we think of where it was presented, because it was presented in an environment. It was presented in an environment similar to the store, and its logic can only be understood if we try to create the situation in which it was initially positioned. Now, how does one do that? Well, we can imagine it. We do have an installation shot, and thankfully in this installation shot, what one sees here are painted cotton duck canvases, the same canvas that Frankenthaler, Morris Louis, and others were using, that are then shaped, Stella shaping his canvases, that's 1962, and literally arranged in an environment where you, as a spectator, have to awkwardly wend and circumambulate around these things as they're physically imposing themselves on you. As you're trying to make sense of an overinflated thing that seems to dwarf you and seems to haunt you. That almost Oldenburg spatializes painting, but he spatializes it as it disintegrates into the physical environment around it. And I'm convinced that he's engaged with painting on this level. If you look at the top of the floor burger, you'll notice he pours paint similar to someone such as Morris Louis, and it forms rivulets in the folds of the bun. And so, I mean, it seems as if he's so heavily engaged with the code of painting, and certainly we understand this is soft material. It's a critique of monumentality. It's a critique of the bronze. It's a critique of the phallic upright monument. But at the same time, it's a painting, and it's a spatialized painting. And thinking about Oldenburg and the fact that he's creating a spatialized painting that's meant to address you physically, that was meant to be situated with a whole wealth of objects around it that made your movement difficult, curating this, installing it was a real challenge. How can I replicate that physical interaction with this Oldenburg? And so I tried by positioning the burger in a way that made it awkward to move around that space, just to see if I can replicate the physical situation of the store. So size, yes, you know, when we think of Oldenburg, I mean, many people want to think of this as just a replication of the burger, but it's actually quite abstract and perverse, meaning it's almost, you can imagine a burger that's been inflated, this pneumatic thing that is expanded almost to the point of abstraction. And then if you think of abstraction and you think almost of each of these canvases as so many stretched monochromatic fields, you can see that it's a much more complicated object than a mere depiction of a burger. But size. So size matters, and it certainly mattered to Warhol. So Warhol, this picture is an interesting picture insofar as it was cobbled together in 1964 and sold, but it was at first two distinct panels. There was the silver panel, which was exhibited in the Ferris Gallery in 1963 in Los Angeles, and then this panel, which was then later fused, and then they were framed together and sold as one. Now, we know that the screen-printed image of Elvis is from a publicity still by Don Siegel in this film, Flaming Star. Generally, I think many people approach this picture as one of, you know, Warhol attempting to think of painting in the age of film, or is it Warhol's criticism of celebrity by likening it to the silhouetted figures on monochromatic grounds one finds in Byzantine mosaics, or, you know, in the case with, you know, the blue pigment, you know, you can think of Giotto's religious murals in the Arena Chapel. I would like to think that he is engaging with the whole problem of celebrity in painting, and in particular the problem of Jackson Pollock. So how are these things installed? So in 1963, you go to the Ferris Gallery, you're greeted literally at the entrance. Here you have the sign, and you have Elvis, and he's shooting visitors as they're, you know, approaching. So, you know, you think of when Capro describes painting enveloping you, painting invading your space. Well, here you're literally aggressively addressed by a hyper-masculine figure, you know, discharging bullets into your body. And then, you know, above you enter, and you have these life-size figures that are dwarfed over you that seem really to be imposing themselves on your space, but they're painted silver. Now, I look at the upright Elvis, I look at the hyperbolic performance of masculinity, I look at him wielding a phallic object of a gun, his frontal defiant stance, and I think of the spread from 1949 in Life magazine to Jackson Pollock, who, to every American family that had a subscription, and there were many who opened the spread, saw that he was the greatest living painter, became a celebrity. So there he is in all of his masculinity in front of his picture, addressing you, defiant, arms crossed, you know, the unbridled masculine specimen from Wyoming, you know, a real Western, not an actor. And here he's presented with his pictures. Now, Pollock was really known for his silver enamel paint, and that really seemed to be his innovation. And in the life spread, you notice below him in this work on paper, really what's highlighted is his silver, his trademark silver enamel paints. And I'm convinced when, you know, we think of silver Liz, silver Elvis, where is silver coming from? I mean, everyone wants to link it to the silver screen. I think that's the easy reference one can make when you have screen-printed reproductions of film stills. But I would like to think that Warhol is making a meta painting, and that he's really thinking about what is the status of painting in the wake of its, let's just say, degeneration into a celebrity object, and when artists are now becoming celebrities, when they're becoming, you know, household names, people discussed at the tabletop. But then you also think of the athletic abandon of Pollock's iterative gesture of flinging paint on the horizontally prone canvas. And you think of Warhol and his studio assistants horizontally screen printing repetitive objects onto horizontally prone canvas. So you think of you think of Jackson Pollock flinging paint, and yes, it might be a spontaneous gesture, but there is a certain amount of control. One can almost anticipate where it will fall. How will it fall? If you flick your wrist in one direction, how will the paint spatter? And it's almost as if Warhol is, through comparing the flinging of paint to the screen printing process, which is quite elaborate and tedious, it's almost as if he's making the argument that Jackson Pollock's expressivity was always mechanical, just as me and my studio assistants are mechanical, and we want Jackson Pollock to be this expressive figure of, individual, of existential angst, but, this is just factory labor, and that's all it ever was. And I think, Warhol really was that cynical when he repeats Elvis across the panels. He is making almost a mockery of the repetition of the areas of flung paint, the iterative flinging of paint of Jackson Pollock. It's almost as if he is negating it. But, Warhol's funny. And so we think of, the two panels and increasing of size, and we think of 1950s painting, and remember Greenberg and the argument of the decorative, where the painting becomes so wide that it floods your retina, becomes an object of pure visual pleasure. And you think of, these lambent reds of Barnett Newman that just literally expanded before you. So Warhol, it's almost as if he wants to take that violence of visual bombardment that one encounters in a picture such as Barnett Newman and liken it to the anesthetizing repetition of a tragedy of an automobile accident. Almost as if, the visual pleasure and aesthetic sense of loss and bliss that one has in front of, the bright red of Newman is, it's just as deadening and hypnotic as, the repetition of a tragedy on television. But you also notice that, he also, to this silk-screened canvas, he adds another canvas that's painted, and it's so cynical when you think he decides, I can make this a better picture if I just increase its size, just add a monochromatic panel, it'll be big, it can compete with Newman, it'll probably sell for twice as much on the market. And this was the status of painting for Warhol, meaning painting has become fragmentary, it's become a commodity, and it's something that's mass-produced, and it's something that one can just cynically expand through a mechanized modular logic and simply increase its value. But the painting's fragment, and the fragment as the manner whereby these artists, these pop artists, can register the shift in sensory life that one experienced in the development of late capitalism in the 1960s. And when you think of what I'm trying to describe, I'm thinking of large billboards, I'm thinking of television, I'm thinking of garish colors, I'm thinking of, you have the rise of the satellite, you have new notions of speed. I mean, the sensorium is being reconfigured, and people's eyes and bodies are being bombarded literally with objects. And many of these artists, especially Rosenquist, were trying to come to terms with this shock of late capitalist modernity. And for him, he was able to register the shock, the fragmentation of experience through the modular canvas. Here we have a painting that's comprised of 3 panels. But what's so lovely about this Rosenquist is look what he does here, the tire track. And he likens it to the 10th Street touch of abstract expressionism, meaning here, the frayed, serrated edges, the agitation that we find in abstract expressionism, well, it's really just the index of a tired print. Or how the iterative repetition of a Pollock reflinging paint becomes literally equated to Fordist labor, where you have the frame of doors becoming the cone of vision that recedes into the picture. Or here, you have the streaking of forms, speed, becoming the streak that one finds in abstract expressionist painting. And here he is using primary colors, but he literalizes the codes of abstract expressionism. So here are the different panels so that you can see them distinctly. There are 3 separate panels, and they are configured together when they are hung on the wall. And this does come from a tradition of collage, but what we see with Rosenquist, with Warhol, painting becoming a fragment, meaning it can be indefinitely expanded. It cannot actually really describe or totalize an experience. And this was their way of trying to register this new shock of late capitalist modernity, the inability for one to come to terms with one's surroundings, to describe what they're experiencing when they walk down a street in Manhattan, meaning how does one narrate the shock of Times Square, where you have endless, bolts of light shot into your eye. You can't there's just no way to describe that in a narrative form. So, painting is reduced to a fragment. It's not total. But you see, this is at odds with Greenberg. And I juxtapose these two competing interpretations of Pollock to show how painting could literally, bifurcate into two very different traditions of the fragmentary painting with mass-produced gestures of images in Warhol or Rosenquist, or in Olitsky, where you have the carefully modulated sprayed colors that create an atmospheric mist that hovers before your eyes, where color seems literally liberated from all materiality and floats in front of you as a pure decorative plenum. But Greenberg and Olitsky was one of his favorite painters. Notice what Olitsky does. Yes, we have this atmospheric mist that floats before you, but the painting has an edge, and the painting is framed, and the painting ends. The painting will remain anonymous, and the sensations of painting will always be visual, will always be motivated by color. They will never be motivated by anything outside of its confines. Whereas when you have Capra, the pop artist, responding to abstract expressionism and its mechanization into so many hyperbolically performed expressive touches, instead it becomes compared to mechanized labor, Fordist assembly line labor, or speed. So when we think of how we make sense of painting in the 50s and 60s, we can make sense through the pure visual sense, the pure pleasure of color, or the sense of coming to terms with the shock of a hyper-industrialized society that aims to dislocate its subjects. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. That was like a total whirlwind. And where to begin? If any of you have a question, just wave at me or Sean, and we can bring you a microphone.
You talked about color and line and shape. What about time for those performances or almost performances?
It's an interesting question that you ask, and allow me to enter the slideshow. Time. May I have assistance? I think I know how to do this. I should know how to do this, but I do not. All right. Time. Well, you're right insofar as pictorial unity is generally thought to occur in a moment of vision, meaning it happens before your eyes in the blink of an eye, in einem Augenblick in German, meaning, and it's a punctuated synoptic moment. It's a discrete moment in time. But as you see with the disintegration of painting into performance, as we do at the Raygun Theater of Oldenburg, certainly time becomes embedded, and painting is a process that begins to realize itself over time. And so, yes, I think time does enter the matrix of painting. Time was an issue for critics in the 1960s, especially Michael Fried when he wrote his essay in 1967 in Art Forum entitled Art and Objecthood, where for him, art, painting, was that which you engaged with and realized and experienced in a synoptic moment of what he would call pure presentness. But objects, the everyday, that was experienced through time. And for him, painting was to banish any sense of duration. There were criticisms of op art, for example. The Responsive Eye was an exhibition that surfaced at MoMA around this time, and one experienced those optical illusions and those vibrations explicitly in a temporal manner. And for someone such as Greenberg, that was somewhat of a gimmick. It wasn't legitimate. And so time was suspended for some critics, but then you can see for someone such as Oldenburg, time was fully embedded in his practice, in the performance, in a happening. How else would it realize itself?
Hi. Yeah. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I guess basically, I wanted to know when you were talking about. Well, first of all, I kind of wanted to know why. I mean, obviously Clement Greenberg is a huge figure, but why did you sort of focus your talk through the lens of his views? Why were his views? I guess in 2016. Why is that the view that matters to talk about?
I mean, I can answer that. I mean, there are biographical reasons, I guess, if I can indulge in my, when I was a young graduate student, this color field painting was what I cut my teeth on. It's what I wrote my master's thesis on. It was my first love. And of course, to understand that, you had to understand Greenberg. I think when we think of Greenberg and we think of what he was doing with painting, Greenberg, and you'll notice, and I didn't quite unpack this in this talk, but he's a dialectician, meaning, you have abstraction, cubist, rigid abstraction. It's negated by expression. So when expression negates abstraction, you get abstract expressionism. I mean, it's a very Hegelian. And of course, Hegel is the one who inspires Marx. And Clement Greenberg's a Marxist. And what he's trying to do is rescue painting from capitalism, fascism. And the only way to do that is for it to entrench itself within its medium and articulate its own fundamental logic, lest it become a commodity. And so he's rescuing painting from all that is wrong with modern society. Now, when we're in 2016 and we see that everything that he was combating in his 60s has been completely and utterly exacerbated to the point at which it's not even recognizable, you can't even theorize it, I would like to think, as someone who does believe in the autonomy of art, who does believe that art should be transformative, it should not merely be a reflection of the world that surrounds it, but it should in fact be, let's just say, a critical engagement with its surrounding that could perhaps enact change, meaningful change, that someone like Greenberg should have relevance. I think artistic autonomy matters. I think the moment art becomes political, it becomes propagandistic. We've seen this before. We've seen this with Cultural Revolution posters in China. We've seen this with Nazi propaganda, with neoclassicism. And, so we need to think about our history and what role we think art needs to play. And I think we do have to learn from our historical errors.
Right, but it's interesting that you're talking about how this, and with this painting in particular, this sort of technique of showing the brushstrokes and all that, and that a lot of that was sort of came from artists who had to flee Europe during the war. Is that what you were sort of getting at? And they came to New York or the States and started.
It was a happy coincidence. New York really benefited when you had artists, intellectuals who had to escape Europe lest they be murdered. And Alfred Barr coordinated the escape of many artists in the 40s, in the early 40s, with Peggy Guggenheim out of Marseille. Many artists who couldn't escape through Marseille had to, many of them tried to cross into the Spanish border. Many people died. And these were also intellectuals. For example, Walter Benjamin committed suicide at the border when he realized he couldn't cross. And so when you have this exodus of intellectuals into a city such as New York, clearly things are going to change, right? So, here you have Gorky, who, he's stuck in Cubism, and then you have André Breton, you have all the Surrealists arrive, you have Peggy Guggenheim, who was hanging out with the Surreal. They learn new things, right? Style is going to change, and this is partially why many argue that New York did become the center of art production in the wake of World War II, and it really had nothing to do, it had everything to do with the fact that Europe was decimated, and you had an influx of intellectuals who were uprooted from their homes, who then had to live in exile for some time. Some remained indefinitely, such as Marcel Duchamp, and they created a new market in New York, which and it remained an international center until maybe recently, now that the art world has been completely globalized.
But did Greenberg not sort of see the irony that this sort of art that he thought was more pure, is a direct result of politics? These people never would have come there if.
But he wouldn't. For him, autonomy in painting is political, and he had no qualms about that. He would refer to himself as a Trotskyist. His formalism. It comes out of certain socialist theories. It comes out of Russian formalism. It comes out of Trotsky. But his dialectical system is one that comes out of the Frankfurt School. People like Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, and these were people who at that time in Europe were combating fascism textually. Meaning they saw what was occurring in terms of capitalism congealing into these fascist regimes that were quite horrifying, and these people were writing against that. And so I do think that, yes, I don't know if it's in any way contradictory or paradoxical that I would say Frankfurt School Marxism, because he did, Clement Greenberg translated Max Horkheimer text. He did read German. I know that he translated Lukács, And I know that there's also correspondence in archives between Horkheimer and Meyer Shapiro discussing Clement Greenberg. And so, he comes from that tradition. So his version of autonomy, it is politicized. Autonomy is always politicized. You want to be autonomous from something. You want to escape from something. And clearly he felt that painting would be the, let's just say, the only anecdote to a world that he found to be, increasingly difficult to live in.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks very much. It was a really inspiring chat. I wanted to ask, when you had said that the repetition in Warhol with the car crash was to be really overwhelming, and I had always thought of it as being sort of underwhelming and kind of reversing that, and that there's so much that you just become inured to it. And in the same way with the repetition with the Marilyns, where if you have a whole bunch of Marilyns, it's like, well, yes, you're not special anymore, but then the one where there's just the one small face on the gold one, and that's what made her very special, just having that singular one. So I just wondered if repetition, it was meant to be overwhelming.
Right. I guess what I said was the anesthetizing repetition, and what I wanted to emphasize with the anesthetization of repetition is the emptying of the sign, meaning through repeating, you empty something of meaning, and it becomes just an endless murmur of the same. And so when you look at, Silver Liz, when you look at some of Warhol's repetitive pictures, you'll notice that the ink begins to bleed outside of the confines of the forms and the screen prints, and they almost become blots. And when I look at Warhol and I think of repetition, and I think of how he is almost satirizing Jackson Pollock's repetitive gesture of flinging paint, it's emptying both of meaning through the repetition of the silk screen, he's almost creating a kind of blot, a meaningless blot, almost that, one could interpret a Pollock as just, a meaningless skein, a paint that just simply lays there, and so I would say that yes, but it's through the repetition and the endless bombardment that things become emptied and meaningless and generalized. And I guess maybe I could have been more explicit instead of just tucking an adjective into the sentence.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Hi. Yeah. Yeah, that was great. I'm wondering how you understand Frank Stella's color choices with eccentric polygons, the variations, and just the overall palette.
Okay, let me find our example. So when you're referring to irregular polygons, you are referring to something such as this, OSIPI 2.
Yes.
I think many people who work with color around this time, they are looking at the interaction of color published by Albers. And when I look at the fluorescent yellow area, and then we have this green band, and then we have tan, it's almost as if this tan and this fluorescent yellow, they're keyed at the same value. And I think because of that, they engage one another in a dynamic manner. And I also think that the tan also has a dark value that almost matches this gray that is at the center of the pentagon. So then those two areas begin to interact in odd ways. And the green is just, it's vibrant, it's garish, it's high-keyed, it springs outward. And so I think when he started to use the fluorescent pigments, he wanted colors that were garish, colors that would either recede dramatically, protrude dramatically, but he also, within a particular canvas, would choose colors that would relate. And I think, he would look at their hue, he would look at their value, in order to heighten the tensions that they would establish with one another. So I guess my answer to you would be that he was using fluorescence, and I do think that there's an element also of kitsch, meaning he wanted to use something garish and somewhat tacky that would shock people that they'd find distasteful. But I think he's also working within a traditional system of color interaction as outlined by Albers, that Albers famously published in his treatise on color that everyone read. And Ken Nolan was at Black Mountain College where Albers taught, and I think also in terms of using high-keyed colors that recede and protrude, he's also thinking of Hans Hofmann and his series of push-pull. So, it's funny, but, Stella is very academic, and I'm convinced that, he read a series of color, and he, not only wanted to upset everyone with garish fluorescence, but, he wanted to make complicated pictures, and so he keyed his colors just so that they would be active and that they would create enough illusion, but not too much. Did I answer? Okay.
I'm just starting my education about art. I'm a neophyte. When I look at the paintings, is it more, like what I've learned today, is that it's more about technique and color and blending? Like when I looked at They Will Take My Island, I'm trying to interpret what the artist is showing me and saying, and I don't get it. But am I more to be enjoying his lines, his strokes, his color, than to try to interpret what he's meaning to me?
It's a funny picture, and yes, you're right, there is a figurative impulse, and it certainly warrants attention. So I think what we see in the foreground, I think what we see here, so this to me appears to be some kind of blanket. Here you have a human body, this must be an arm, here you have some really strangely disarticulated fingers that are becoming claws. And, here it appears as if, you have like a completely deformed, here's, I think, one contour of a figure, but then here's the other, here's a head. And then here you have another figure. But it's associational, and, I think with Gorky, you're invited to try to interpret what you see and try to relate these lines to figures and maybe create a narrative situation. But it's also, he's an adherent to surrealist automatism. And so, what they would argue would be, you take your brush, dip it in paint, and then you just allow your body to unconsciously draw. And then from these unconscious gestures, something by chance will emerge that most probably has significance, meaning to you personally in your psyche. What I really wouldn't know what this would have in terms of significance to Gorky on a personal level. I mean, if he has fantasies of bodily fragmentation, or but when we think of surrealism, I think yes, figuration is to emerge, but that wasn't the intention. Does that make any sense? Meaning, so the technique was really what was paramount, and then what we imagine emerging from this tangle of lines and these fields of disaggregated color is really, I think, to be left to the imagination and to chance.
Yeah, that's what I was getting, that it's more about technique and color. So thank you.
No, you're very welcome.
Hello. We have a question from online. We've been live tweeting this and live streaming it, and our audiences have been loving it. I hope you guys have too. The question was about the actual, I think, 1964 premiere of this show at the AGO, and they were wondering if you could talk about the critical and public reaction to it.
Greenberg's exhibition, it's funny because Greenberg's exhibition went from Los Angeles to the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis to the AGO. It was not in New York. And I find that significant already, meaning I think Greenberg wanted to export his ideas, his artists, their style to an audience that wouldn't be dismissive, which I think the New York critics who have their own commitments would probably want to do, and he was already controversial at that point, so we had already earned enemies in terms of our critics. The reception in Canada was actually quite positive. I think at that point you already had Jules Olitsky in 1963 in Saskatchewan at Emma Lake teaching workshops. Clement Greenberg was invited. Subsequent to this, Kenneth Lockheed and Jack Bush, who were involved with the Emma Lake group, who were orchestrating the invitations to that annual seminar, were inviting these pictures. But then you also had the rise of art dealers in Toronto who were then selling these artists and exhibiting these artists quite regularly, and were actually quite successful in terms of selling paintings by these artists to collectors. And one reason why the AGO has such a deep bench of paintings by Lewis, by Nolan, by Olitsky, by Frankenthaler, is a result of Torontonians' collecting practices and taste. And I would say that this exhibition had an impact on the community of collectors and of artists, but it didn't just have an impact on the Toronto collecting community. It also had an impact on schools of art that emerged in Saskatchewan, that the Emma Lake School, and other forms of painting in the prairies. I would also say that when I look at acquisition history, some of these paintings we acquired quite early. For example, this. Okay, it's always difficult to know if one's moving forward or backward. One moment. This Lockheed we purchased from the show. So when you think of how the show would have been received in Toronto, if we're buying paintings off the wall, I think our audience enjoyed it. I know that this painting, Kenneth Noland, was sold we purchased it directly from David Mirvish in 65. We purchased this directly from David Mirvish in 66. So I think when Greenberg arrived with his stable of artists, he certainly shaped taste, and I think Toronto responded well, and Greenberg had a market in Toronto. It's also one reason why I took this job, because I knew that this was a city that had welcomed a style about which I care very deeply, and I would be able to work with a collection with material about which I'm very passionate, and I would also be able to work with collectors who share my tastes, and priorities, and commitments, and as a curator, you really cannot ask for much more than that.
Hi. Is that where Jack Bush comes into play? With Greenberg in Toronto?
Yes.
Okay. Could you expand a little bit? Because Color Field and Helen Frankenthaler and...
if you read the correspondence, Clement Greenberg was certainly advising Jack Bush about, how to compose, how to use color, how to paint, and those archives are in our library here. Jack Bush is also mentioned in some criticism written by Greenberg. If you look at the collected volumes that were edited by John O'Brien, there are 4 volumes issued by the University of Chicago Press throughout the 90s. Bush is in the index. So, Bush was on Clement Greenberg's radar. Clement Greenberg mentored him. Clement Greenberg helped exhibit him, helped put him in contact with people who would buy paintings. And so, yes, there is certainly a relationship there. And again, it does make sense. Again, Jack Bush was certainly already trying to work through certain formal problems, in the late 50s, early 60s, but then there was just happened to be the happy coincidence of the Canadian reception of Clement Greenberg and post-painterly abstraction. And it just, again, wasn't just Toronto, but also at Emma Lake in Saskatchewan. And in Edmonton, there were many painters, and there were many early exhibitions in Edmonton. And I think there was a network of artists, including someone such as Kenneth Lockheed, or Arthur McKay. There are many others who were within Greenberg's orbit.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you. It isn't really a question. I just want to say I've just started taking painting again as a retiree, and the most important thing about what you've talked about tonight for me was talking about the actual process of painting and what the artists were doing and the way they were interacting with one another. And the impression I got from your talk was that there were developments in the actual practice of painting in Europe that were not mirrored or were not happening in America, and that's why the people coming into America from Europe, that's what made the difference. Whatever the reasons for the difference, it sounded to me like painting was developing in a very different way in Europe.
There were certain artists who were aware of, Léger, or who were aware of Miro, or who were aware of Matisse. But when you think of the history of exhibitions in New York, and you think, of the history of the Museum of Modern Art, you really didn't have exhibitions on these artists in the United States until the late 30s to 40s to 50s, in 1954 being the major Matisse exhibition, where everyone was finally able to really look at the entire breadth of this man's career to see how the great colorist of the French tradition used color over time. And I would say even with the major Picasso show of Alfred Barr, and I think Alfred Barr was really instrumental in making some European styles more accessible. I think there were always groups of people who were aware of what was happening in Europe, but when you look at the visual record, you read art criticism, Greenberg would dismiss a lot of artists as regional, meaning, for him, abstract expressionism was a sign of a cosmopolitan avant-garde, not one that articulated locally. And for him, that was a sign of advanced art. That was a sign of an actual avant-garde. And so Jackson Pollock, before he becomes acquainted with someone like Siqueiros, or he gets involved with people in New York, he was painting in a regionalist manner of Thomas Benton. I guess a lot of his paintings are in Kansas City, and so you can see where Greenberg can be dismissive of these regional styles that only exist in America, and then when you have this cosmopolitan avant-garde emerging that is really taking the best of art practice globally, or at least from Western Europe, that he begins to champion this style. But I think people knew about surrealism. People read Cahiers d'Art, and people, there were printed journals, and people can see black and white photographs, and they can get a sense of, oh, this is what Miro's up to. But I really think with the history of exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, this is when I think the real lessons were absorbed. And I think also the GI Bill, where you had veterans from World War II who then received stipends from the United States government to study, and many of them would study in France with Osip Zadkine and and other studios in Paris, and they would learn because they were in Paris. They could go to the museums, they can look at the pictures, they can learn the techniques of the historical avant-garde, and then they were able to adapt them to their practice. And but so I guess my question to you is, it depends, meaning, those who are wealthy of means, who could take a European tour, sure, they knew what was going on in Europe. But, I mean, if you're painting in Kansas City, Missouri, I mean, you have Well, I hope you found it useful.
I think we all did. Okay. So, Kenneth, I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your passion for this field and breadth of knowledge. If any of you, like me, want to actually go upstairs to the galleries to look at the paintings again, for those of you in this room, the gallery is open till 9. You could do it right now.